Hi there, and good evening. Welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, find us at jimbotalk.net, and you can follow me on Twitter at JimboTalks. He did it on purpose. That is the conclusion reached first by French investigators and now reluctantly by officials of German Wings, the airline which flew that Airbus Flight 9525. The co-pilot, now all agree, deliberately flew that airliner right into the side of a mountain. Suicide, as some would call it, as the head of German Wings put it, when someone kills themselves and 149 others, that is murder. Let's talk about this tonight with aviation expert Ken Jenkins, who joins us again this evening. He is the a leader in the field of aviation emergency management and is the author, by the way, of the book Resilience, Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters, in paperback from SEGR Enterprises. Ken, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you again.
Now, we hear about how this guy had passed all of the psychological profiles and all the training. There was apparently one brief interruption at one point a few years ago as part of his training. He was interrupted for an unspecified reason 6 years ago, but he had 630 hours of flying time. Not a lot, but he's been there. Extensive psychological and aviation review testing since training began 7 years ago. You tell me, first of all, if you think that is adequate to find a potential psychological defect. Sounds like it to me.
Well, and that's a difficult question to answer, only because I don't know the depth and the scope of the psychological testing that German Wings performed. But, you know, Jim, when you're looking at a pilot entering into commercial aviation, and even with 630 hours, which, you know, he accrued, they don't just come in not knowing what, you know, how to fly a plane. I mean, they already have hours under their belt. And it's a very expensive position to enter into, because the pilot normally pays for all that themselves out of pocket before they come in. So there's always this certification process ahead of time where when they do come to work for a commercial airline, the airline's really scrutinizing the performance of the pilot, not only from how well they perform from a standards level, if you will, but also from a psychological level. Each airline's different as to how they assess that. Some certainly put more emphasis on it than others, but not knowing what tools they use, that would be a difficult question to answer.
Yeah. In general, from your experience, do you think that we do a pretty good job? And by we, I'm talking about the airlines of the developed world, which I think is the only standard to which we can really repair here. Do they, in general, do a pretty good job of at least trying to weed out any complete misfits from such a position of great responsibility?
I think they do, and if we look at the history of aviation, there's only, thankfully, less than 5 accounts of where there is suspected pilot suicide, if you will, or, to use what was described today in your introduction, murder, if you will. Less than 5 instances of that, which that's 5 too many, if you will. But considering the millions of flights that take place every day, or over a year rather, there are thousands of flights each day worldwide, I think the airlines do a good job. Keep in mind, though, and let's look at the United States as an example, many of the pilots come from the military, and so you have all that rigorous testing through the military, the psychological evaluations through the military, then the airlines also continue that as part of the pre-employment process. Where I think we're going to start to see some discussion worldwide is what happens once the pilot joins the airline. They do go through medical certification each year, but do they go through any psychological certification each year? And I think that's where we're going to find some changes may need to come about.
And, of course, we should keep in mind, too, that the airlines using the military as their farm system, much like the NBA and the NFL use the NCAA as their farm system, that's becoming a little harder these days because we're not having as big of an air force. Our military pilot, well, I won't say needs because that's not true. Our needs are as high as they ever were, but our capabilities are shrinking. And as a result, the airlines cannot count on this ready crop of extremely well-trained and not terribly old pilots coming in.
No, you're exactly right. And you and I have talked about that before in terms of the say even today there's a pilot shortage, particularly within the regional jets. Within the United States, too, and I thought this was somewhat interesting looking at Germanwings versus in the U.S., in the United States, a pilot had to become a first officer, had to have a minimum 250 flight hours to sit in the right seat. And in July, I think it was, of 2013, it may have been 2014, I'm not sure which, Jim, but the number of hours increased to 1,500 hours. And that was a minimum that a candidate had to have to sit in the right seat.
Now, the right seat, that's the co-pilot seat, right?
That's the co-pilot seat, and that's a huge expense to them, as we've discussed in the past, because that is at the expense of the candidate. And in Europe, it's lower. And
obviously, well, this guy had 630, and as I said, it sounded like a lot to me, but then again, that's just to me. I gather that by the standards of the industry, that would be considered minimally acceptable, if that.
And that would be a new recent standard. So prior to 2013, of course, it was much lower in the U.S. And that doesn't indicate, and certainly that if you had 1,500 hours, that would mean you're less likely going to, fly a plane into the mountain. But it does have, it helps weed out candidates that aren't serious about the position. The aviation industry is a very professional field, particularly when you get into the pilot ranks. And there's so much it takes to get to that level that it's very rare that you see what we just saw a few days ago with Germanwings Flight 9525.
1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626, as we continue to look at this starkly frightening story. It is, of course, the general assumption that, well, when you're standing, let's say, on a subway platform, and you're waiting for the train, and you're surrounded by other people, and it is your assumption that while, yeah, it could happen, but mostly people are not going to run up to you just as the train comes in and push you onto the tracks. It is our assumption even more so when we're talking about anything but the random public, but highly trained, and as we have been discussing, it sounds highly screened individuals. That the general assumption is, otherwise it's hard to go through life, that most people, most of the time, are not going to go bonkers weirdo on you, and sometimes in a very grisly and fatal way. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. Ken Jenkins, professional emergency manager with extensive experience in planning, logistics, training, deployment, response, and after-actions analysis, is our guest this evening. He has assisted air crash survivors and victims' family members and directed a large corporate response team. He also set up and led command centers and spent 11 years managing the customer assistance relief effort at American Airlines. He is the author of the book Resilience, more about which a bit later on. Your thoughts about where this investigation in Europe is leading. 1-866-50-JIMBO. Back in a moment. Welcome back. This is the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. As we are talking tonight with a man who has done a considerable amount of time studying the possibilities of things going wrong in the aviation industry, which is generally quite well run. Ken Jenkins is his name, and he is our guest, the author of Resilience from SEGR Enterprises, subtitled Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters. Now, something that we've got to keep in mind, I suppose, here is how many times this co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, might have tried to do this before. I mean, let's face it, it was predicated on the pilot going to the bathroom. Your thoughts on that, Ken?
Well, and that's interesting. As I've been watching tonight and through the day about Lufthansa and Germanwings talking about the history of this pilot. And from what we see so far, albeit there hasn't been anything that's come from the search of his home or his computers or any of the information like that yet, is that for all intent and purposes, he was a very professional and polished pilot. And if there had been any kind of indication of this before, there are reporting systems that most airlines have, albeit voluntary, but if it's something this egregious, somebody would have reported it. And from what we're hearing, he has a pretty spotless record, if not spotless, unless we find out over time in the next few weeks that was indeed not the case. But so far, it looks like there was nothing that showed any type of activity that was going to lead up to what he was going to do. Yeah.
It is just very strange. I know they've been going over the complete list of the passenger and crew, all 150 people, looking for any cross connections between Lubitz and anybody else, like a grudge that might be involved, looking for anybody's linkage with anything that's remotely terroristic, and so far we're told that search has produced nothing. Just a truly bizarre circumstance. One thing that certainly has been noted, and that is, of course, that voice recorder. And all that you hear on that voice recorder is very calm, even breathing. This guy, as he was flying into certain death on the side of a mountain, wasn't even breathing hard.
Jim, and it's frightening. And this morning when, we all woke up and heard this revelation that the co-pilot deliberately did this, I contacted a friend of mine and a colleague who lost her brother in an accident 20 years ago. And she had spent a lot of time shaping aviation, shaping the aviation industry in terms of family assistance and things of that nature. And she's also a clinician in social work. And I called her and I asked her, I said, how do you feel about this? I said, it's not an accident. If you, as a family member, what do you think about this? And she said, it's certainly shocking. And the family members that were in France that went to visit the site today were certainly very emotional about this revelation. But what she said to me was, what concerns me are the things that are reported in the media, like his breathing, like you were just talking about. And she said from a clinical standpoint, they use the term normal breathing. She said, I'd want to know what the breaths were, what's the spacing between the breaths. And if we don't see any type of up or down in terms of, does it get rapid, does it slow down, and it stays steady, she said, what scares me is that this is somebody that not only did it deliberate, but borderlines or could be a psychopath. And those were her words. And she said, that's what's frightening about this, outside of the fact that 150 people were killed. And she went on to say that, I have no doubt that what's going to happen, and we're starting to see this, is that they're going to start looking at any other indicators that may have been present before this flight, any type of stressors. And you mentioned cross connections, which the FBI from the United States is assisting with and looking at any connections there may be, and then also family history of mental health issues. And all of those things will be examined to help pull out what might have been his motive to do what he did and to do it so calmly.
1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. One would assume, and again, assumptions may or may not be safe depending on how much you know, and I don't know a whole lot, but one would assume that anybody who is so psychopathic that they could do this with that perfect calm breathing would have exhibited some other symptoms somewhere that would have been discernible either to the lay public, people who associated with Lubitz, or to certainly somewhere in his psychological testing, that we would assume that there are ways to spot this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I make that assumption based on blind faith in the system. So take it for what it's worth.
Well, I think it's worth a lot, because when you look at suicide overall, and and I lost a family member to suicide a number of years ago, and I have some friends that have lost family members to suicide, and maybe at the time, you think something might be a bit off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. It's usually not until the act itself has been done, in many cases, where hindsight's 20/20, and you say, oh my God, I remember this, and I remember this, and I remember this, and I should have seen it, and I didn't. And that's what I think is going to be very telling over the next 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, as this investigation continues, and they search the computer, they interview friends, they talk to family members and coworkers, and you can bet Germanwings and the investigators are going to be all over this to see if there was anything that somebody missed that contributed to, or they would have known that this event was going to happen or something catastrophic might happen.
Yeah. 1-866-50-JIMBO with our guest, Ken Jenkins, the author of the book Resilience. And here's James in Nashua, New Hampshire. Good evening, James.
Good evening, Jim, and guest. I had a question, and I've been thinking about it today.
Uh-huh.
I work in a security and an anti-terrorism arena.
Uh-huh.
However, this doesn't, and this could be many things. I was just wondering, from a psychosis perspective, has anything been discovered? And you may have been speaking about it, and I might have missed it while I was making my phone call in. Has the passenger list, and is the passenger list being bumped off of the pilot, the co-pilot, to see if there was any potential relationship from anybody at all on the passenger list?
Yes.
Because
they are doing that at this juncture. They have announced that they're not done, but so far no connection whatsoever.
All right.
And James poses an interesting question, and what would be a telltale sign there would be if this co-pilot wasn't scheduled for this flight and somehow at the last moment got thrown onto it or
got himself put on it.
Exactly. I was going to say bid, but you don't bid for him at the last minute. Where he got placed onto this, then that would certainly be somewhat ominous. But it's unlikely, I think, that they're going to find a connection if it was his regularly scheduled flight. I don't know, but it's certainly going to be looked into.
Yeah, absolutely. James, thank you for your thoughts. We appreciate that. I've thought about this, as a lot of people I'm sure have, and I suppose I could conceive of being so depressed that I wanted to end it all. I haven't really ever felt that way, but I know there are people who have, and there are people out there, I've heard their stories, and I've thought, boy, I'm not sure how I'd continue in that circumstance. But I cannot recall ever in my life thinking, or even thinking of the possibility that I might think, I am so depressed, I'm going to end it all. But I want to be sure I go out as a monster. That doesn't occur to me. No, I mean, as I say, I'm not planning on offing myself, but if I do, it'll be real quiet and alone. I'm not going to take the whole world with me.
Well, and that's, well, I hope I'm glad to hear you're not going to.
No, trust me, I'll be around forever.
But to take, as you said, a lot of people with you, all day I've been thinking about this type of situation and what's happened and what we as the flying public, and, I throw myself in there. I'm not a pilot, but I fly a lot for work. And, since 9/11, things have changed a lot.
Yeah, and we're coming up on a break that doesn't move here, but I want to come up with that 9/11 and the changes that have occurred in these past now coming up on 14 years with Ken Jenkins in just a moment. Welcome back. This is the Jimbo Hannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-504-4626. We're talking about the determination now made by first French authorities and then, after initial denial, understandable denial, concurrence now by the executives of Germanwings, the airliner in question, that the co-pilot of this flight, Andreas Lubitz, did indeed apparently wait until the pilot went to the bathroom, blocked the door, and then calmly flew the plane into the side of a mountain in the most avoidable accident conceivable. And our guest, Ken Jenkins, was talking about how things have changed since 9/11. Ken, please proceed.
Hey, thank you. I was thinking actually from a passenger standpoint, Jim, is you know how things have gotten tighter and tighter on the planes in terms of seat pitch and whatnot, and everybody's complaining about, you know, whether your seat reclines and carry-on luggage and all those things. And while that's going on, the other dynamic that has changed is that if something goes wrong on a plane, you know, you have an unruly passenger or whatnot, the passengers, along with the flight attendant crew, are the first ones to jump up and nip it in the bud. And, you know, I find that amazing to see since 9/11 what everyday human beings like you and I are willing to do to help protect the flight. But that's behind the cockpit door. None of us ever anticipated we would have to deal with the folks sitting in front of the cockpit door.
Yeah.
And so what do? You know, the new reinforced doors were great at keeping people out, and that's what happened in Germanwings. So I bet we're going to start to see some differences with regards to how those doors are manufactured and changing some of those processes and procedures based on what happened here.
I would still have to think that in general that you are much better off keeping the deranged from getting from the outside into the cockpit than from the deranged appearing in the cockpit where they were hired to be. But I would note one thing that aviation expert Sully Sullenberger said this past day, and that is he noted that in this country there is apparently a Federal Aviation Administration rule that there have to be 2 people in the cockpit at all times. I suppose that would mean that when one of the pilots has to go to the bathroom, that a flight attendant sits in the cockpit, but
or enters in, and so you have 2 people in there. If it's an international flight, you might have a relief pilot that will go in, and you know, during that time for a few minutes. And typically, you'll see some other measures that the flight attendants will take to block the aisle to keep anybody from rushing the door as it's being opened and whatnot. And, you know, so those precautions are taking place here, but they didn't take place in the Germanwings incident. It's not a procedure that Europe follows, and I'm not sure that Asia does either. But we're starting to see even airlines today in Europe, Norwegian Airlines already made their announcement that they plan on following the same rule that airlines are following in the United States.
Yeah, it certainly would make a lot of sense, and it's sad that one reaches this conclusion this way, but that's how progress is made, often painfully. Looking at just what all took place and what all is done in the course of events, if you could change any procedure, either as it's used in Europe or the U.S., wherever, what, if anything, would you change? Keeping in mind that something that should be in the context for this entire discussion, and that is human perfectibility is impossible. You can minimize such things as happened on Flight 9525. You can't eliminate them. People are fallible. But in that context, are there reasonable changes to procedure that you could see being adopted besides the Europeans adopting the American policy of 2 people in the cockpit at all times?
Well, that was what I was going to go with, but you took that option away from me.
So that would be about it, huh?
No. Actually, there are others. That's certainly going to be key for. I think that should be a policy that is worldwide for aviation. But that aside, I think there should be a way to. You know, there's an override system in the door now, where on the cockpit door, where after 5 minutes there's a 30-second window. I think what we're going to see and what needs to be done is a different override process where you can get in and somebody can't just lock you out. And only a handful of people on the aircraft, whether it's the number 1 flight attendant, otherwise known as the purser in many cases, can do it, or the pilot that has stepped out of the cockpit. And I think there needs to be some ongoing psychological, for lack of a better word, Jim, an exam. If we're going to go through and have a medical every year, why not also look at the psyche at the same time.
Yeah. Well, it certainly makes sense to me, and obviously there's so much at stake. Why you can't even talk about expense in a case like this, even if you discount 150 lives, the expense of replacing that plane and lost business and insurance claims and lawsuits, there isn't a level of psychological training that would be too expensive for this kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point. I mean, if you're looking at an international carrier that's flying a 777 or an A380, I mean, a 777 on the high end can get up to around $350 million. And I don't think we're going to look at that kind for just one. So I don't think we're going to be looking at that kind of cost overall for an airline into that kind of millions. But if it saves 150 lives, as you said, it usually takes an accident before changes are made. This is going to be the accident that makes those changes, I think.
1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. There seems little doubt that the co-pilot did it calmly and deliberately. Back with our guest, Ken Jenkins, the author of Resilience, in just a moment. Welcome back. This is the Jimbo Hannon Show. We're looking on the crash of Flight 9525 of Germanwings, a crash which it has now been determined was, in fact, caused by the co-pilot deliberately, and as we have noted, calmly, for no apparent reason. No emotional distress that we have detected, no terrorist ties that we have detected, no grudge against a passenger that we have detected, just out of the blue. Weird. And as we go to the next call here, there's something that has occurred to me. In many cases, of course, people on a plane, they may note a sudden disorientation as the plane heads downward, although this was going downward but not precipitously so. Or they may hear an explosion or something or see a fire on an engine. But in this case, you had the specter of the pilot desperately banging on the door. They had 8 minutes to mull that over, Ken.
And that's just a horrific thought. And the cockpit voice recorder picked up those minutes, Jim. And it wasn't until, at least from what we've heard from the press briefings, or from Germanwings and the investigators, was I think when he first started, the pilot first started trying to open the door, only those that were seated closest to the cockpit door were aware that something was amiss, and as that 8 minutes slowly dragged on and he couldn't get in, and the knocking and the pounding became louder and louder and louder, that people realized something was going on, and the cockpit voice recorder then started to pick up those voices of people screaming and shouting.
Yeah. Let's talk to Greg. He's in Sioux City, Iowa, on the Jimbo Hannon Show tonight. And hello, Greg.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for taking my call. I just want to make it real brief. Obviously, it's a horrible tragedy.
Oh, yes.
You need to make sure that everything goes good after, if not before, if we can. I'm originally from California, and what we always do is we always talk about this stuff after it happens. So let's try to prevent it before it happens, like an earthquake or something like that.
Well, obviously, prevention is certainly important. The key, of course, is knowing just exactly what it is that could have been done to prevent this. And that's the key factor here. So far, most of what we've talked about, most of what the investigators have revealed points to a big, fat zero. There was no peg on which to hang any kind of removal of this pilot from the cockpit. So far, nothing.
Nope. You're right.
Yeah.
And no, I understand that. Like I said, it's a horrible tragedy, and we just need to, I think we need to, even though it happens, we just need to educate this, what might happen before and especially after. Then let's just get everything going good again.
Amen to that. Thank you, Greg. We go to Bob in Rolla, Missouri, listener to KTTR Radio. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Jim. I missed this earlier. How did they discover that the co-pilot did this? Was a voice recordings from one of the black boxes?
Yes, the voice recording.
And,
they've listened to the voice recorder, the flight data recorder. The last time I checked, they had found the casing of the flight data recorder, but the impact was so great that it had actually knocked the recorder out of its metal casing. But the voice recorder, although damaged, yes, they were able to pick up all of this.
The pilot banging on the door and,
yes.
And all the voices.
Exactly.
Okay, like I said, I missed that earlier, but that's very interesting and good information that they can uncover that. So,
yeah, I mean, certainly that part of the system seems to have worked. In fact, I'd love your thoughts on that, Ken. So in terms of having the information necessary to piece this together, that seems to have worked.
Well, it does, and there's another piece of information that came out today, and that was, and I don't recall the name of the company that did it, but they were able to determine that the co-pilot, once the pilot had left, had not only programmed the descent of the aircraft. We've been talking about the last 8 minutes. He actually programmed it to descend to 96 feet, which is obviously into the ground. So it was intentional. It was picked up via the transponder, and so they know that he actually did that he physically made that change. To Greg's or Bob's comment about taking care of this beforehand, I mean, even with the psychological testing, Jim, if they do that, you can pass that and be fine. If it's once a year, there are other life stressors that occur that, from 1 year to the next time you're evaluated that could make these changes, where you become an individual that wants to bring a plane down. So I'm really not sure how you do that except to reduce the risk as much as you can through your procedures. One of those is the two people in the cockpit. Another way would be a self-reporting system where a pilot could report another pilot without any fear of retribution that says, I've seen this activity, I'm concerned, and somebody can go tap that pilot on the shoulder and have a discussion about it. So there are a number of things I think that can be done. It's just whether or not they're going to be. One of those ways is having a video camera in the cockpit. And it sounds great on the surface, but how does it prevent Germanwings 25 from crashing?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk to Bill in Northport, Florida. Hello, Bill.
Oh, I was just wondering about if the pilot was programmed to do it, and then, like the Manchurian incident.
The Manchurian Candidate, the movie?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting thought. We have obviously no indication at this juncture that something like that could have happened, but given how far we are from even the most slender reed in which to place this whole thing, I guess that's at least worth a cursory examination, Ken.
Well, and I agree. I mean, Bill brings up a good point, and that is, if you think back, Jim, to the day this accident occurred, there certainly was a lot of speculation about what brought the plane down, where everybody was focusing on that descent, and was it rapid, was it too rapid, was it normal, what was it? And over the course of simply 24 hours, the whole focus has shifted to speculation about motive from the co-pilot. And what's going to take a larger amount of time now is to delve into that history that we talked about at the beginning of the show to find out what was the mindset of this man. What were the stressors? Were there any events that helped this along to make him make this decision? And I think that's going to take a lot longer than 2 days that we've been so far.
Yeah. One thing I would note as we go to the break and to come back with more calls would be, had I been a passenger and seen that, I'm a pretty big dude, and I would have been throwing my shoulder into that door with him. I don't think that door would have stood up to several of us banging away.